All right, now we're going to look at Joy Priest's wonderful essay, Toward a Black Femme Fugitive Poetics. Joy Priest, here she is, amazing, amazing poet. We got some of her poems in our packet. Check her out, read her. Let's jump right into the essay. This is a difficult essay. It distills some very complicated theoretical paradigms and terms and lays them out in a wonderfully beautiful way. The essay, it really jumps off of, you got to watch the video and read the essay, Audre Lorde's Poetry is Not a Luxury. And it takes that and runs with it for right now, the contemporary. Let's look at Priest. Let's jump in. This is Essay Writing 101, this beginning here. Let's look at this. Little scholarly attention has been given to schools or movements of black femme poets and poetics, aside from the naming of poetic cohorts and collectives that include male identified poets, and in spite of the recent frequent occurrence of black women poets holding the office of the United States Poet Laureate, Gwendolyn Brooks, 85 to 86, Rita Dove, 93 to 95, Natasha Trethewey, 2012 to 2014, and most recently Tracy K. Smith, or serving as two out of the total five inauguration poets in U.S. history, Maya Angelou for Bill Clinton in 93, and Elizabeth Alexander for Barack Obama in 2009. So there hasn't been any scholarly attention on this poetics or poets or works specifically, just the naming. And Priest she's gonna change that here with this essay. An investigation into the assemblage of the black femme figure and fugitivity, where they can be found in contemporary poetry, might trace a critical lineage of black femme poets practicing a fugitivity from the logics of white supremacist, heteropatriarchal society, or what Fred Moten calls the durational field of slavery and its aftermaths. So that's what she's putting out here, right? Poetry as resistance, poetry as these things, pushing it back, specifically a black femme poetics here. And more particularly, performing a refusal of the family construct that such a society constitutes through the language of its canonical and legal documents. The goal is to trace, here's the essay, right? Here's what she's doing. She's laying it all out. Here's the thesis. The goal is to trace a genealogy, which is a feminist methodology, and to use that genealogy to identify, in the work of others, specific survival strategies of the black femme figure therein, which are illuminated via her unique standpoint and practice of fugitivity. So we have those bringing forth of ideas, poetry as illumination, poetry as a way forward in Lord, and Priest is taking that and specifically locating that in the work of some contemporary poets here. And here's I love this part in this essay, and this is what we've been talking about all semester in class. Important to this investigation is a question frequently presented to poets: does poetry do anything? Which can be understood as: does poetry affect change? Is it activism? Is it active? Is it in action? And that's the question, right? What does poetry do? We've been arguing about this all class. Obviously, Audre Lorde says it's not a luxury; it's a necessity. It does, but this is still these questions are never going to go away. Post-structural feminists and queer theorists have argued that gender and bodies are socially and discursively constructed. That quote social agents constitute social reality through language, gesture, and right here, here's what Priest is saying: through language, gesture, and all manner of symbolic social sign. When one considers, all right, here's Priest's answer to that question. When one considers the ways in which language constitutes our bodies and subjectivities, and when it becomes clear how important a role language plays in our society's ideological schema, then an intervention into language, a defamiliarization of language, an interrogation of language, or an invention of new language, all of which poets do, can be radical acts that do. So this is what Priest says, and you can think specifically of how black women's bodies are regulated, relegated by white patriarchy, men in power, people in power, and how language constitutes our bodies, right, is used. So you're taking the language and reappropriating it. So look at this. This is what poets do: intervention into language, defamiliarization of language, an interrogation of language, or an invention of new language. And Priest says all of which poets do can be radical acts. Language is the medium through which a culture's ideologies, narratives, and subjectivities are created, perpetuated, and maintained. And here's what she does. In the following, I outline a crucial role that poetry played in the decentering of white feminist concerns during the second wave of hegemonic feminism. All right. Feminist and queer. Here's her poetry as a tool for feminist theories. What poetry did, and we're gonna skip around. I'm not gonna read this word for word. I'm gonna set up Priest's argument. Look at what she's doing with her argument here. Then I'm gonna leave it up to you to look at the poets and the poetry at the end of the essay. Feminists and queer theorists have discussed the role of poetry as a tool to intervene in hegemonic, that's the power structures, right? All the power structures, feminism and epistemic violence. In the late 60s, women from the margins of the feminist movement, namely women of color, used poetry as a way to name and circulate their particular oppressions and subject positions apart from the more prevalent narrative and visible concerns put forth by white feminists. T.V. Reid, a scholar of feminist social movements, suggests that poetry was an organic outgrowth of the women's movement during the 70s, when consciousness-raising groups called on women in the movement to come together in group sessions and share their experiences in order to open up those experiences as structural analysis. So there's the quote there, right? Because certain of women's experience, and back to women's experience, think of Audre Lorde, poetry is not a luxury, it's experience, right? Because certain of women's experience hadn't been taken up in the larger scholarship, there was no theory available about the race or ethnic specific oppressions they were experiencing in their lives, and often those oppressive structures occurred across spectrums of difference. Women of color were left out, right? More marginalized women, here's this, more marginalized women, Black, Native, Chicana, queer, were hard-pressed to get their issues on the docket of the feminist hegemony, and as a result, poetry became an important strategy to disseminate their voices and concerns. And here we go. Here's her essay. In her 1977 essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury, the feminist poet Audre Lorde reflects on this moment. She famously writes, here's the essay we just read. This is poetry as illumination, for it is through poetry that we give name to those ideas which are, until the poem, nameless and formless, about to be birthed, but already felt. Lorde argues that poetry, and the essay's from 77, it was collected in the 80s there, that text. Lorde argues that poetry can be a tool to articulate our unique subject positions, identify oppressive structures, and conceive of our own specific demands for change. For her, poetry was not a luxury, it was a revolutionary act, and we looked at that. It did things. This would come to be seen by other queer feminists of color in the 80s with the publication of This Bridge Called My Back, Radical Writing by Women of Color, 81, an anthology edited by poets Cherie Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa, as well as the biomythologies of Lorde and Anzaldúa, that it's a famous book, Borderlands, La Frontera, all of which use, quote, poetry to articulate both a collective women of color position and various ethnic specific positionings, end quote. The experiences, work, and demand for rights that are not included in the canonical narrative of feminism, that have existed within and between its metaphorically impoverished waves. So think of the waves of feminism. Typically, and Priest is arguing this here, women of color have been left out. Yet outside of history can be recovered in the poetry of that era, and it continues in the poetry of today. So, and here's what Priest is doing, and we're going to skip around a little bit. I'm not going to read this word for word, but I'm going to hit some of the highlights. Taking the lead of transnational feminist Michelle Rowley as set forth in her 2012 article, The Idea of Ancestry, of Feminist Genealogies and Many Other Things, I wish to recover a lineage within which to situate a black femme fugitive poetics. Here's what Priest is doing. This is the lineage. making an intervention into the white middle-class, U.S.-centered wave metaphor of feminist history. Rowley argues that, quote, genealogical narratives, whether at the individual, societal, or national level, do important work in providing a sense of belonging, end quote. However, she argues, we must change how we go about putting together these genealogies to avoid practices that exclude women and femme bodies in and outside of the United States. The wave metaphor, here's that wave, all the feminist waves. Here she's pushing against this, right? She's kind of decentering, arguing against the wave metaphor. The wave metaphor, which marks historical moments for U.S. feminists, and specifically U.S. feminists who are white and middle class, can exclude women of color, women outside of the national boundaries of the United States, and women with the U.S. boundaries but outside of the legal definition of a citizen. Furthermore, such a chronological metaphor restricts the feminist movement to certain causes such as suffrage for white women, reproductive rights, and workplace discrimination, while leaving out more nuanced intersectional issues that affect marginalized women. So that's why she's doing this, right? Let's skip around a little bit. Priest is setting this up, and we're going to look at, the title of the essays. Here's some questions she posits right here. When we let established watershed moments of the dominant historical narrative guide our feminist genealogies, this is the broad swaths, the broad waves, we are already restricted in the possibilities of who we might find and where we might belong. All these other people get swept under the rug, right? All these important people. Rowley argues that we should pose, quote, an analytical question of a specific area of investigation. And that's what Priest is doing. This specific area, the Black Femme Fugitive Poetics. A research question which allows for new rather than descriptive knowledge to emerge. For me, this is Priest right here. This is great. That specific area of investigation is Black Femme Fugitivity. And she posits these questions here. What poets have engaged in this act or have written this act in the past? What poets are writing it now? Around what themes are Black femme poets in conversation? And what interventions or strategies can their catalogs illuminate? This is what I set out to investigate in this paper, and what I found was a new feminist genealogy particular to Black femmes practicing and writing about fugitivity, and, specifically, a fugitivity from the Western colonial cultural formation of the family. So she's arguing a singularity here with Black poets, and she also argues, this is kind of controversial, I'm fascinated with this moment, the heteronormative family structure is another power structure that keeps black women and women in general subjugated. All right, here she kind of defines and sets up fugitivity. This is important to look at. Here's her theory building here. She's jumping off Fred Moten a little bit. Fugitivity is an analytic that no one, well, I said Moten, but not just Moten, but he kind of takes it a little further, that no one Black scholar is responsible for. This is because rather than being simply an abstract concept, fugitivity is rooted in an actual historical moment. It was a practice of enslaved Black people, or as a way escaped Black bodies were socially constructed in legal codes of the United States. One moment in which to historically isolate the origins of fugitivity or fugitive Black bodies is the moment of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which was passed by Congress to give effect to the Fugitive Slave Clause in the U.S. Constitution. And we're looking at the act and language of the law here, right? Quote, respecting fugitives from justice and persons escaping from the service of their masters. Here's this quote right here. Show that the free Black body has been positioned as transverse to justice since the country was founded. The law was later reinforced by 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which required even free states and the government to capture and return slaves to their masters. Though this was later repealed in 1864, it was arguably enforced by still more legal codes and vigilante justice. Here's Moten. All right, so here's how he's taking this and repositioning it. Through fugitivity is a historically constructed subjectivity with material consequence. I wish to focus specifically on the poet and scholar Fred Moten's theory of fugitivity, which he introduces in his first book, a critical text called In the Break. So here's what Moten does. Moten, by locating fugitivity as an essential component of jazz, in his first poetry collection, Houston's Tavern, Moten titles a poem, Fugitivity is eminent in the thing but it's manifest transversely. In other words, here's Priest taking this. For him, being fugitive is to exist or operate within, to be inherent to the thing, while simultaneously manifesting perpendicular to the thing. Put more simply, someone practicing fugitivity lives within the thing, within the confines of the thing, is of the thing, but also exists in conflict with the thing's systems. What is the thing? The thing is the institution, the cultural formations of Western colonialism. The thing is the durational field of slavery, that catastrophe, and its aftermaths. All right, a little bit more. More about fugitivity. Fugitivity, then, is a desire for and spirit of escape and transgression of the proper and the proposed. It's a desire for the outside, for a playing or being outside, an outlaw edge proper to the now always already improper voice or instrument. Here, this is Priest, I read the proper and the proposed as a normative social and cultural formations imposed on us and the resulting institutions. The us here is African Americans. Chattel slavery, Catholicism and Protestantism, marriage and the heterosexual bourgeois nuclear family, constitutional law and prison, capitalism and banks, etc., etc., etc. To be black is to be fugitive. In other words, and here's how Priest is taking this and resituating. In other words, fugitivity is flight from or refusal of while also within an oppressive structure. Think of an oppressive structure. One impressive structure is the neoliberal university. Think about this, right? It's think about the university, the college as oppressive structure. Some of the other institutions and interventions that have been taken up and identified by those theorizing around fugitivity are North American chattel slavery and astrology, the North Star, state government school to prison pipeline and charter schools, capitalism and teleological notions of progress, the straightforward progress, right? Nation, state, borders, and migration. And before we get into what Priest wishes to do, you think of the university. The university is a structure of power, right? Who has the power? And think about all these structures of power. We can't get out of the structures of power. I mean, obviously, you cannot go to college, not go to university, but she's arguing we're within these structures of power. We're within these things. So within these things, we can push back and transform and argue with and change them from inside. We can be kind of transgressive. Inside the institutions, we can be transgressive. Here's what Priest says. I wish to localize Moten's concept of fugitivity to the black femme because I am interested in her assemblage of identity as she exists within, but transfers to these institutions, and the specific way she is in flight differently and additionally from the standards of the proper and the proposed. All right, here's the controversial part here. She looks at family, the construction, and I'm going to quickly go through this because I'm looking at the poetry stuff a little bit more. You can close read the essay. It's fascinating. She argues that the family is a structure of oppression. The construction of gender reinforces the strength of a national project. Here's the article. Sinha says, the family constructed as a natural, heterosexual, and patriarchal unit performs a variety of critical ideological services in the constitution of a nation. In other words, here's her summation of it. In other words, the Western configuration of the family is not natural. It has been constructed in the interest of the national project at a certain point in history. Right, so she says that the family, heteronormative family, is a patriarchal unit of oppression for the women, especially the black women. All right, we're going to skip around a little bit. I want to skip around. Forgive me. Let's get into, she talks about the fugitivity, the family here. It's interesting. You can check this out, read it. I want to look at specifically quickly the black femme before you move into the poetry. All right, the black femme here. When she has this little headline, the black femme, here's Priest. I will be employing Kara Keeling's concept of the black femme as theorized in her first book, The Witch's Flight, the cinematic, the black femme, and the image of common sense. In her introduction, another litany for survival, itself a reference to the Audre Lorde's poem, A Litany for Survival, Keeling defines the black femme as, quote, a figure that exists on the edge line between the cinematic and cinematic reality, and what Gilles Deleuze refers to in his study of cinema as a radical elsewhere, end quote. Here, the phrase radical elsewhere is crucial to my import of Keeley's concept of the black femme. The figuration of the black femme as existing on the edge or in a radical elsewhere places her in a long tradition of existence at the margins or in liminal spaces. You think of Du Bois' double consciousness, Gloria Anzaldúa's Nepantla, and opens up possibilities of a black femme sociality outside the hegemonic constructions of the national project and durational field of slavery and its aftermath. So the black femme is pushing back, transgressing, creating her own space here. All right. Here's how the cinematic comes in. Here's what Priest says at the bottom here. Rather, the cinematic is a way to think of the means by which images of the black femme are produced and reproduced in popular media and culture. These means have existed alongside or introduced and constituted by the cinema and its technologies, but are not always produced and packaged for the cinema. So you can think of a repackaging. And here's in the next paragraph. Keeling argues that by looking at the black femme as she exists in the in-between, here's these in-between spaces, the margins, we might observe strategies for survival simply because of her existence in this liminal space. Because of her unique subject position, the black femme, quote, challenges each of the primary categories that have been constructed in response to racism, sexism, homophobia, black women and lesbian respectively. And Keeling writes, quote, because she is often invisible, but nonetheless present, when she becomes visible, her appearance stops us, offers us time in which we can work to perceive something or differently. By looking at the movement or flight of the black femme, we get a momentary snapshot into the possibilities of a different world. A new configuration of family, an opening into an elsewhere. From these snapshots, we might recover black femme subjectivity and strategic fugitive practices from Western social formations. And she does some more theory building here, looking at Haraway, Collins, Hartsock, Haraway, Cyborg, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's flip around a little more. And so she sets up this. She has the Moten fugitivity, argues that she has the family pushing against that, the black femme. So Priest does some wonderfully succinct, cogent theory building. And here she goes, and we're gonna stop here a little bit because I'm gonna let you read these poems on your own. Here she has the headline, A Genealogy of Black Femme Fugitive Poetics. And here she argues she's looking specifically at these specific poets. For the purposes of the genealogy I wish to trace in this essay, I want to define black femme fugitivity. Here's how she is specifically defining it. As an escape from, quote, the proper and proposed, end quote, black heterosexual nuclear family, which is a social formation in the aftermath of the, quote, durational field, end quote, of U.S. chattel slavery. Some of the poets here are writing poems about fugitivity. Some of the projects of the poets here are themselves an act of fugitivity. She looks at the second poetry book of Vivi Francis, Horse in the Dark. She summarizes the book, quotes from specific poems, argues how they're practicing this fugitivity. So you can look at that. This is how this is Joy Priest in her essay, taking all these broad, abstract, theoretical concepts, zooming in on these poets, showcasing how they're doing this work. So there's Vivi Francis there. We'll keep moving on. You can check this out. Two more. She close reads this. Goes on. Natasha Trethewey's 2012 collection, Thrall, is a project of fugitivity. She has an interview here, and she quotes from specific poems. And that's she looks at these poets here that capture these moments of fugitivity, pushing against this, enacting how Priest reads this. And we get to the end here. Like Francis, here's the kind of wrapping it up. Like Francis, Trethewey challenges the limits of Western epistemology and its dictations of impossibility. The black speaker quotes her white father's actual words, illuminating the irony therein. This earlier moment that the speaker is reflecting on sets up the sort of knowledge production to which she was subjected as a student. The speaker admits, quote, here's the poem. I did not know in the subtext of our story that my father could imagine Jefferson's words made flesh in my flesh, the improvements of the blacks in body and mind, in the first instance of their mixture with the whites, or that my father could believe he'd made me better. So Priest is quoting Trethewey, quoting the father here, and how Trethewey's turning it around, resisting in these in-between spaces. As the black daughter of a white man, the speaker is subjected to her father's subscription to Enlightenment philosophy and white supremacist ideology, even as he loved her and her black mother. But within the act of writing, the poem and the book in its entirety, a book that challenges those epistemologies, Trethewey has enacted a flight from her father and from the United States epistemic violence and hegemonic narrative. So we have the V. Francis and Trethewey. Priest is holding up these two poets as paradigms for the new Black Femme Fugitive Poetics. We see the essay, a quick walkthrough, and what it's doing, how it extends Audre Lorde's poetry is not a luxury, and how it thinks of new ways to counteract the present moment